What if I told you that you can double any kind of investment you make in just 90 days? Does it sound fishy? Well, you'd be right to be suspicious, as those kinds of promises are most likely a Ponzi scheme. But what's a Ponzi scheme and why is it called that? Today, we're diving into the story of Charles Ponzi, a poor immigrant who started with nothing but dreams and ended up engineering the biggest financial scam the world has ever seen. His scheme was so notorious that more than a century later, his name still defines a whole category of frauds. Charles Ponzi was born in Logo, Italy in 1882, though he was originally named Carlo. In pursuit of easier acceptance in English-speaking nations, he adopted the name Charles by 1904 as he embarked on his travels abroad. Not only did he go by Charles Ponzi, but he also used the alias Charles P. Blanchi, among others. But before we get too deep, it's important to approach the stories of Charles Ponzi's life with a healthy dose of skepticism, as much of what we know comes from fragmented interviews and his own autobiography, which he modestly titled The Rise of Charles Ponzi, Memoirs of a Financial Genius. Ponzi was a figure of considerable charisma and persuasive ability, traits that served him well but also fed into his penchant for reshaping the truth to his advantage. Charles came from a family that was initially affluent but had nearly lost all its wealth by the time of his childhood. This financial downfall pushed Charles into poverty, compelling him to take up a job as a postman for some income. In the early 1900s, it wasn't uncommon for Italian immigrants to move to the United States in search for better opportunities, with the goal of returning to Italy wealthier and more successful. Motivated by his family's expectations and the desire to restore their former status, Charles arrived in Boston in November 1903 with only $2.50. By 1904, he had decided to Americanize his name to Charles Ponzi, fully embracing this new chapter of his life in the United States. Despite the language barrier, lack of financial resources, and absence of social connections, he managed to find employment first as a dishwasher in a restaurant and eventually worked his way up to a waiter position. Driven by the ambition to amass wealth quickly, he concocted a scheme to steal change from customers, pocketing it for himself. However, his illicit activities didn't go unnoticed for long, and he was promptly dismissed from the restaurant. By 1907, after a series of failed endeavors and in an attempt to escape the financial downturn plaguing the United States, Charles relocated to Canada. Upon his arrival in Montreal at the age of 25, he learned about an Italian immigrant, Luigi Zarocci, who had made a successful business into the American market through the cigar trade. Zarocci was also the founder of Banco Zarocci, a banking institution aimed at serving Italian immigrants in America. Eager to connect with Luigi and perhaps see a reflection of his own ambition in Zarocci's success, Charles went to great lengths to meet him. He presented himself at Charles P. Blanchi, inventing a fictitious wealthy background and claiming false experience in banking to make a strong impression. Luigi took Charles under his wing, initially hiring him for minor tasks before entrusting him with more significant responsibilities. It was in this capacity that Charles began to learn the ropes of what would later fuel his notorious schemes. Luigi's bank enticed customers with the promise of a 6% interest rate, a figure substantially higher than the 2% offered by most other banks at the time. Charles, ever observant, quickly deduced that the only way Luigi could afford such a generous rate was by dipping into the deposits of new clients to pay off those wishing to withdraw their funds. This risky strategy was a disaster waiting to happen. If all clients decided to withdraw their money simultaneously, the bank would collapse overnight. The wonkiness of this setup was exposed in 1908 when customers began to suspect foul play. Luigi, sensing the impending trouble, fled to Mexico with the bank's funds, leaving his family and Charles behind in Montreal. In the aftermath of Banco Zarocci's downfall, Charles was miraculously cleared of any wrongdoing. However, his troubles were far from over, as he soon found himself complicated in a different matter, a minor but foolish check fraud. When investing your hard-earned money, it's important to do it on a trusted platform. That's why I'm glad to say that today's video is sponsored by Webull. With rising inflation rates, investing becomes more and more necessary. Making an account with Webull only takes a few minutes, and once you sign up, they'll give you anywhere from 3 to 75 fractional shares. You can literally deposit 1 cent, and they will give you free money. VGP Lounge is a Reddit user who got insanely lucky with this promotion and got $3,000 worth of Tesla stock just a few weeks ago. Even if you don't get as lucky as VGP Lounge, you're still getting paid to do something that benefits your future. Make sure to get your free stocks with the link down in the description below. After losing his job, Charles was desperate for quick cash. Seizing an opportunity, he encountered a former client of Banco Zerochi associated with Canadian warehousing and stole a checkbook from him. Using the checkbook, he wrote a check to himself, meticulously forging the company owner's signature, but was quickly caught. His confession led to a 20-month prison sentence in Montreal. But Charles Ponzi was not one to be easily deterred. Shortly after his release, he was arrested again, this time for attempting to smuggle Italian workers from Canada into the United States. This led him to prison in Atlanta in 1911, where he served a 2-year sentence. Upon his release, Charles returned to Boston in search of work and redemption. He then met Rose Maria Gnecco, an Italian immigrant whose family had also immigrated to the United States. Charles quickly proposed to her, choosing not to disclose his criminal past. However, Charles's mother, in a surprising move, sent a letter to Rose revealing her son's history. Despite this revelation, Rose accepted Charles's proposal and they were married in 1918. As Charles took on various odd jobs, his past remained a shadow over their new life together. Yet they looked forward to the future despite the challenges that lay ahead. In addition to various jobs, Charles Ponzi found himself briefly employed in the fisheries owned by his father-in-law. After a series of unsuccessful professional ventures, Charles began to devise what would later be known to the world as the infamous Ponzi scheme. It was in the latter part of 1919, through his professional exchanges with European contacts, that he was introduced to the concept of international reply coupons. This system, established in 1906, was intended to facilitate international mail correspondence, allowing the sender to provide their overseas recipient with the means to respond at no additional cost by exchanging the coupon for the appropriate postage at any post office. Charles immediately recognized the potential for profit within this system. He began on a journey of arbitrage, a financial strategy that aims to profit from the temporary price discrepancies observed between different assets, in this instance, IRCs. Due to the variable value of these coupons depending on the country of purchase, Charles realized he could buy them at a lower price in one country and sell them at a higher price in another. His plan involved purchasing large quantities of IRCs on European markets and then selling them in the United States, a strategy he believed could yield profits up to 400%. Arbitrage by itself was not illegal, and if Charles had strictly stuck to this plan, he might have avoided legal complications. But to amass a significant inventory of coupons from Europe, Charles first needed to secure capital. With a $1,000 loan, equivalent to roughly $17,000 in today's currency, he established his own business, the Securities Exchange Company, in January 1920. From a modest office in Boston and armed with undeniable charm, he began to pitch his business model to friends and acquaintances. The proposition Charles Ponzi offered was both simple and audacious. It was a two-part promise. If investors trusted him with their money, he guaranteed a 50% return in 45 days, or an outright doubling of their initial investment in 90 days. This meant that an investment of $100 would yield $150 in just a month and a half, and $200 in 3 months. Given such an attractive proposal, investors were quick to reinvest their profits, anticipating even greater returns. The allure of the scheme was irresistible. After all, who wouldn't want to see their investment double in just under 100 days? Investors were immediately drawn to Charles's venture, pouring in millions of dollars in what seemed like an endless stream of capital. This might raise eyebrows today, with hindsight on our side, considering the average bank interest rates back then were a modest 5% annually. But Charles had exceptional charisma, and the prospect of easy money proved too enticing for many to resist. Within the first month alone, his company attracted 18 investors, contributing a total of $1,800, an amount equivalent to about $31,000 in today's dollars. This quick influx of funds let Charles repay his first group of investors by the next month, solidifying the trust in his venture and sparking even more interest through word of mouth. The snowball effect was immediate. Between February and March of 1920, the investment in his company skyrocketed to $25,000, a staggering sum at the time, comparable to nearly $400,000 in today's economy. This growing trust and eagerness to invest allowed Charles to rapidly accumulate wealth. Within just a few months, he turned into a significant figure in financial circles, a remarkable feat considering his humble and questionable beginnings. However, it's crucial to remember that the foundation of his scheme was originally based on trading international reply coupons, buying them cheaply in Europe and selling them at a profit in the United States. Yet this strategy was quickly dropped. The logistical nightmares and potential for raising suspicion among authorities made it an unviable option. The sheer volume of coupons needed to make a substantial profit would have required shipping capabilities on the scale of the Titanic, a clear indicator of the plan's impracticality from the start. In truth, Charles had diverted from his initial proposal, opting instead to cycle the money through a web of lies. He used the influx of funds from new investors to enrich himself and to pay off earlier backers, creating a self-sustaining cycle of investment and payout that required a constant stream of new capital to prevent collapse. This maneuvering was a classic early example of a pyramid scheme, reliant entirely on the influx of new money rather than any genuine investment opportunity or financial product. Charles was adept at managing this delicate balance, reassuring investors with high returns and deflecting inquiries into the specifics of his business model. He claimed secrecy was necessary to avoid alerting potential competitors, a tactic that, combined with the consistent payouts, took away most from questioning the operation too closely. As long as investors saw their returns as promised, few looked beneath the surface, allowing Charles to continue his scheme undisturbed. It was a precarious structure, dependent on belief and momentum, without any real foundation, an early precursor to the modern pyramid schemes that still surface today, built on promises and sustained by hope until inevitably they collapse under their own weight. Charles was acutely aware at this point that he had not fulfilled his original promise and that the methods he was employing were entirely unsustainable. However, he was gonna fight this by buying actual investments like real estate. In a way, his plan wasn't entirely foolish. If he could make his scheme profitable through legitimate means, there might be a chance for it to work out. But the flaw in any plan, as always, boiled down to one thing that haunted many of us in our youth: mathematics. The numbers didn't favor Charles, and had he spent a bit more time analyzing them instead of chasing easy profits, he might have realized sooner that such a system grows exponentially, creating a snowball effect. Higher investments might have allowed him to escape the fraudulent scheme and correct his course. Let's say Charles managed to attract investors by promising to double their initial investment in 3 months. If the first 50 people invest $100 each for a total of $5,000, he would need to pay out $10,000 after 3 months. This would require finding 100 new investors willing to contribute $100 each. 3 months later, he'd need to double that amount again, requiring 200 new investors to inject cash into the system. This snowball effect becomes unsustainable because eventually Charles would run out of money to pay back investors, and he would be unable to find new ones. Going further, he would need to repay more than 400,000 investors a staggering total of $20 million in just 3 years, which was just an unmanageable feat. This is why pyramid schemes are doomed to fail and have since become illegal. They are not sustainable over time, collapsing once there's no money to circulate or new investors to recruit. Despite this, Charles lived lavishly. He purchased the mansion in Lexington Brooklyn, as well as a local mobile, which was considered the Tesla of its time. He spent without counting, always on the lookout for ways to legitimize his business and find more money to pay back his investors. In his autobiography, Charles confessed to an overwhelming addiction to purchasing things. His spending spree was short-lived, however, as the very nature of Charles Ponzi's scheme, designed to continually draw in more participants, was also bound to raise suspicions. The first major wave of doubt was triggered by a financial journalist who pointed out the glaring issue with Ponzi's operation. It was simply impossible for Charles to deliver the promised returns to investors in such a short time frame. Aware of this critique, Charles didn't just stand by. He sued the journalist for defamation and won, securing a judgment of $500,000 in damages. Despite this legal victory, public doubt was growing in the man who seemed to have struck gold with his securities exchange company. In July 1920, journalist and editor Richard Grozier, son of the owner of the Boston Post and one of Ponzi's most ardent skeptics, decided to investigate the securities exchange company. At this stage in the story, Charles's actions were under the microscope, with Massachusetts authorities keeping a close watch. Following the publication of a critical article by the Post, state agents summoned Charles, who cleverly diverted their attention from his dubious accounting by proposing a temporary halt to his operations during the investigation, temporarily easing official scrutiny. However, the Boston Post persisted, launching a series of articles from July 26, 1920 that challenged the integrity of Ponzi's entire operation. The turning point came when the Boston Post hired Clarence Barron to dive into Ponzi's scheme. Barron uncovered that despite promising astronomical returns to his investors, Charles himself made no investments in his own company. Instead, he chose to funnel his money into real estate and stocks. This revelation was a critical blow, exposing the shaky foundation upon which Ponzi's empire was built. The investigation highlighted the stark contrast between Ponzi's lavish personal expenditures and the hollow core of his financial operations, further fueling public doubt and scrutiny. This shift in perception marked the beginning of the end for Ponzi, as the investigative journalism spearheaded by Barron and the Boston Post peeled back the layers of deceit, revealing the truth behind the facade of success. Clarence Barron's investigation delivered a staggering blow to Charles Ponzi's credibility, especially when it was revealed through careful calculations that for Ponzi's claims to be true, he would have needed to purchase and exchange about 160 million international reply coupons. Yet, there was a glaring discrepancy. Only 27,000 of these coupons were actually in circulation. The math simply didn't add up, laying bare the impossibility of Ponzi's operation. This revelation hit the front page of the Boston Post in late July 1920, and while many investors remained loyal to Charles, he knew that he was done for. In a bid to salvage his tarnished reputation, Charles hired journalist William McMaster as a public relations agent. However, McMaster, having a keen nose for deceit, quickly realized the depth of Ponzi's deception. Choosing integrity over complicity, McMaster turned against Ponzi, publicly exposing him and his pyramid scheme in the press. He labeled Ponzi as a fool who couldn't manage simple arithmetic, painting a picture of a man leisurely smoking cigars in his office while spinning lies about the international reply coupons. By early August 1920, law enforcement put an end to Ponzi's scam, arresting him at his office. Investigations into his company revealed he possessed only $71 worth of the coupons. William McMaster's articles further disclosed that Ponzi was at least $2 million in debt, with total obligations, including interest, exceeding $4.5 million. The Boston Post didn't stop there. On August 11th, the newspaper published another expose on Ponzi, focusing on his earlier activities and his involvement in the Banco Zerochi debacle. Facing 96 charges of fraud, Ponzi's freedom was at stake, with the potential of life imprisonment looming over him. He pleaded guilty on November 1st, 1920, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Released after 3.5 years, he found himself behind bars again in October 1922 for larceny, this time serving an additional 9 years. Deported to Italy in 1934 after serving his sentence, Ponzi's wife chose not to follow him, remaining in Boston and filing for divorce in 1937. Back in his homeland and once again penniless, years. Ponzi attempted small-scale scams, but achieved nothing noteworthy. He eventually moved to Brazil, where he decided to pen his autobiography. Ponzi spent his final years in poverty, with his health rapidly deteriorating until he died alone in Rio de Janeiro on January 19, 1949. Charles Ponzi's legacy leaves a name eternally linked to deception, fraud, and scam schemes, becoming synonymous with the world of financial scandal. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and have a great day.